1978, the kidnapping of Aldo Moro. The Red Brigades blocked his convoy, murdered his bodyguards, and took him into their custody. He was the Prime Minister of Italy for a total of 7 years. He was kidnapped and held captive before being killed 55 days later. This is just one of the many ways the Red Brigades showed their power and how terrorism can succeed through violence. This is the story of the Red Brigades. The Red Brigades began in 1970, started by husband and wife Renato Curcio and Margherita Kegel, along with friend Alberto Franceschini. They started the organization intent on separating Italy from the rest of Europe, and most importantly to them, removing Italy from NATO. The Red Brigades were a far-left guerrilla group that was heavily armed and intended to do what they wanted through the means of violence. Renato and Margherita had met in college and later met Alberto. Alberto's grandmother was the leader of a smaller anti-fascist farmer organization, and his father was an anti-fascist. Alberto grew up with these people who influenced him into what he became and what he believed in. The group started with half of it with Curcio and half of it with Alberto. They each had roots around something different. Curcio's with Catholicism and Franceschini's was made primarily from rejects from the FGCI, a communist youth group. These people were too extreme for the FGCI, so they were thrown out and helped start up the Red Brigades. The Red Brigades began with small heists and other things like that. The members sabotaged factory equipment and broke into factory offices and headquarters. It was not until 1972 when they did their first kidnapping. They held a factory foreman for 20 minutes while pictures were taken of him wearing a sign that declared he was a fascist. He was released unharmed. Also during that time, the Red Brigades were denounced by well-known far-left political groups because they were so extreme. 2 years later, in 1974, Curcio and Franceschini were arrested and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Curcio was later freed by his wife and a militiaman, but was recaptured later. The same year, 1974, the Red Brigades began expanding. This is when their numbers began to rapidly grow, and the crimes began to increase and become worse and worse. Bank robberies, kidnappings, drugs, and arms trafficking were their major crimes. 1975 was also when they wrote their manifesto. This manifesto realigned them with the thinking of being a more nationalistic, militant group. This manifesto stated its goal was a concentrated strike against the heart of the state because the state is an imperialist collection of multinational corporations. The Red Brigades had started evolving. They had begun to accumulate more and more members throughout the various places they were located. These people were drawn to them because they liked the ideology. They wanted to be a free country from NATO, but most of all, these people wanted to use violence. It seems to me and many other people that they can be classified as terrorists. As I stated above, their main way to achieve what they wanted was violence, and most importantly, kidnapping. This brings us to 1978, the year where they pulled off their most well-known stunt, the kidnapping that made them mainstream and plastered them as terrorists in newspapers all around Italy. Aldo Moro was a Christian Democratic Prime Minister for Italy. On March 16, 1978, Moro was on his way to a session of the Chamber of Deputies. A discussion was to take place about a new government that would have the support of the Communist Party. It was going to be the first implementation of Moro's political views. The Red Brigades, obviously opposing this, blocked his convoy, murdered his bodyguards, and took him into their hands. The Red Brigades believed this was a good strategy. They thought this would help them gain the public opinion, the sympathy. They believed this would start the downfall of the current leadership. They were very wrong. The Longview Daily News wrote, "Thousands of Italians crowd St. John Lateran Square Thursday after the major unions called a one-day general strike to protests. They protest the Aldo Moro kidnapping with general strike." This kidnapping was the opposite of helpful for the Red Brigades. The public had bad opinions on them, and they weren't getting anywhere in their freedom fight. They had sparked anti-terrorism protests, and the Red Brigades were going to go down. After this kidnapping, arrests began to happen. Leaders began to fall. The Red Brigades fought back with more violence, kidnapping the NATO Deputy Chief of Staff. However, In 1980, arrests began to increase. The member numbers started to fall, and finally, in 1988, the Red Brigades dissolved themselves.
The Red Brigades were a ruthless group, fighting to free Italy from NATO, and having its own far-left political views. They used the means of violence to try to accomplish this task, using kidnappings, robberies, and more. While ultimately they ended up dissolving on account of them being arrested, they certainly left a dent in Italy's political side. They left an ever-standing story of violence fighters. The Red Brigades will forever be remembered for their violent tactics, extremist views, and terroristic qualities, who accomplished next to nothing except hurting people, breaking the law, and causing terror throughout Italy.